What in God's name are you doing here?" The words were not a question. They were an accusation, a detonation of disbelief in the frozen, cathedral-like silence of the park. Charles Whitaker's voice, a tool he typically wielded with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel to dissect balance sheets and eviscerate corporate rivals, was now a jagged shard of glass. He had been walking, his mind 1,000 miles and 12 time zones away in Zurich, replaying the final brutal chess moves of a hostile takeover. He was a man who moved through the world insulated by wealth and a ruthlessly curated lack of distraction. He did not look at the unfortunate scenery of the city's forgotten souls. He did not look until he did. Something had snagged in the periphery of his vision. A shape on a bench, a familiar worn canvas bag, and had pulled him from the abstract world of numbers into the brutal, concrete present. He had slowed, looked, and the world had fractured. He was now kneeling on the frozen ground, the biting cold seeping instantly through the fine, expensive wool of his trousers. A pain he barely registered. Before him, huddled on the hard, unforgiving slats of the park bench, was Lena Williams. It was unmistakably her, his former housekeeper. The same quiet, almost invisible presence who had moved through his sterile penthouse with a seamless, silent competence for 2 years. The woman he had fired, without a second thought, without a flicker of human curiosity, 3 weeks ago, for being 5 minutes late. Her lips, he could see in the weak, anemic glow of the park lamp, were tinged with a faint, terrifying shade of blue. Her body, wrapped in a coat far too thin for a New York December, was trembling in violent, uncontrollable spasms. Her exposed fingers, raw and red with the cold, were gripped tightly, desperately, around something. With a heart that was now pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs, Charles gently, carefully, unwrapped her stiff, frozen fingers. Inside her palm was a crumpled, worn receipt, a hospital billing statement. He smoothed it out under the weak, flickering lamplight, his own breath a cloud of white, horrified vapor in the frigid air. St. Agnes Medical Center. Patient, Dolores Williams. Outstanding balance, $1,132.87. Final due date, December the 1st. Tucked next to the folded paper was a small, tight, pathetic bundle of cash. A few singles, a couple of fives, maybe $80 in total, clutched with the fierce, desperate tenacity of a person holding on to their last, fragile lifeline. Charles froze. The cold of the pavement, the wind, the night, all of it vanished, replaced by an internal, glacial dread. The memory, which he had not bothered to retain because it was insignificant, a minor piece of household administration, now came rushing back with the force of a physical blow. 3 weeks ago, that cold, gray Tuesday morning. He'd been on edge, the final pieces of the Zurich deal clicking into place. His breakfast wasn't ready at precisely 7:15 a.m. The international papers weren't organized by market. And Lena had come rushing through the service door a few minutes late, her hair damp with sweat despite the cold, her eyes ringed with a fatigue so profound it seemed to be etched into her very bones. She had mumbled something, an apology, her voice soft, desperate. "I'm so sorry, sir. The train was late. I ran." He hadn't asked why. He hadn't registered the desperation in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture. He had simply, with the cold, dismissive efficiency that had built his empire, said, "You're late. That's unacceptable. You're fired." And he had turned back to stirring his coffee as she had quietly, without a single word of protest, without a single plea, walked away. Now, kneeling on this frozen, desolate bench, with her unconscious and shivering before him, he understood. She hadn't overslept. She hadn't been careless. She had been working a second job, likely all night, cleaning floors in a sterile, soulless office building, or working a graveyard shift in a diner, fighting a desperate, losing battle to keep her mother alive, to pay this bill. The due date was 2 days ago. He had fired her from the job that was likely paying for it. He had, with his casual, thoughtless cruelty, pushed her out of the warmth and into the cold. A raw, guttural sound, something between a sob and a curse, escaped his lips. Fumbling with a haste born of pure, unadulterated panic, he yanked off his own heavy, exquisitely tailored cashmere overcoat and wrapped it around Lena's small, shivering body. The warmth of his own body felt like a pathetic, insulting, too-late offering. "Hang on," he whispered, his voice a raw, desperate plea to the universe, to a god he didn't believe in. "Just hold on, Lena." He pulled out his phone, his fingers stiff and clumsy with the cold and a tremor he couldn't control. 911. "Yes, I need an ambulance. Central Park, near the 76th Street entrance. A woman. She's unconscious. Hypothermia. She's freezing." As he gave the dispatcher the details, his voice clipped and precise even in his panic, he kept his gaze fixed on her face, on the blue-tinged lips and the flutter of her eyelids, willing her to open them, willing her to absolve him with a single conscious breath. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its lights painting the pristine snow in grotesque, pulsating strokes of red and white. The EMTs, their movements efficient and practiced, jumped out. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a kind, no-nonsense face and eyes that had seen everything, gave Charles a quick, appraising look. "She's in severe hypothermia," she said, after a quick, expert assessment, her fingers on Lena's wrist. "Pulse is thready. If you hadn't found her when you did—" He didn't need her to finish the sentence. He knew. "I know her," he said quietly, the words feeling utterly, laughably inadequate. She used to work for me. I had no idea." "She's lucky you came by," the medic replied, her tone professional but not without a subtle, unspoken note of criticism that felt entirely deserved. They loaded Lena onto the gurney and into the warm, bright interior of the ambulance. Charles hesitated for only a second. Then, without a thought for his $1,000 suit or the abandoned Zurich deal that suddenly felt like a child's game, he stepped in behind her, the doors closing on the cold, indifferent night. He had pushed her out. Now he would bring her back in. It was the first desperate act in a reckoning that was only just beginning. The hours that followed were a masterclass in a special, gilded kind of hell, the kind reserved for powerful, intelligent men, rendered utterly and comprehensively powerless. Julian, a titan of international finance, who could orchestrate hostile takeovers and dismantle multi-billion-dollar corporations with a single, dispassionate phone call, found himself comprehensively defeated by the unyielding, monolithic grief of his 2-year-old son. Leo's cries did not subside. They became a visceral, physical force within the penthouse, a sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate with sorrow and fear. He refused the bottle of lukewarm milk the chef prepared. He refused the soft, pure-eyed pears that had been his favorite. He thrashed and writhed in Julian's arms, his small body rigid with a sorrow so absolute it felt like a direct, personal accusation. Julian carried him from room to room, the vast, empty spaces of the penthouse amplifying his own cavernous inadequacy. He walked past the grand piano his wife Caroline used to play, her unfinished sheet music for a children's lullaby still resting on the stand, a silent, mocking testament to a life cut short. He paced the length of the living area, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, indifferent view of a city that was alive, bustling, and cruelly unconcerned with his private tragedy. The penthouse, once the ultimate symbol of his success, a fortress of glass and steel perched high above the world, now felt like a pristine, soundproofed prison, and he was trapped inside with the screaming ghost of his own failure. It was only when sheer, gut-wrenching exhaustion finally claimed him that Leo's cries subsided into fitful, whimpering sobs that seemed to tear at the very fabric of Julian's soul. He, a man who had not properly slept in 18 months, felt a fatigue so profound it was bone-deep. He carefully laid his son in the crib, his movements clumsy and uncertain. He stood over him for a long time, watching the unsteady rise and fall of his small chest, and the oppressive silence that descended in the wake of the storm felt more like a surrender than a relief. It was then, in the dim, warm glow of the nursery's cloud-shaped nightlight, that he noticed them for the first time. The specialized therapeutic leg braces Leo had been wearing were propped neatly on the changing table, their straps and buckles a complex architecture of healing he had never bothered to understand. He had seen the invoice for them weeks ago, a staggering 5-figure sum he'd approved with a detached electronic signature on his phone while waiting to board a flight to Tokyo. He had assumed they were just another futile recommendation from another overpaid specialist, another expensive box to be checked in the long, performative, and utterly fruitless ritual of doing everything possible. He had never even seen them out of their packaging, let alone on his son. Beside the braces, laid out on a clean, folded cloth, was a small, spiral-bound notebook. He picked it up with a sense of trepidation. Inside, Maya's neat, precise handwriting filled the pages. It was a log, a meticulous, patient charting of impossibly small, incremental victories. A grid of dates, each marked with simple, hand-drawn smiley faces for good days and neutral faces for challenging ones, accompanied by concise, clinical, yet deeply compassionate notes. October 12th stood for 10 seconds with Ottoman support, responded positively to the Vivaldi, smiled at the red block. October 14th shifted weight from left to right foot, without support 3 times, fatigued easily, but did not cry, responded to music. October 16th reached for stuffed bear, Barnaby, while standing, held on for 30 seconds. A new record, almost let go of the Ottoman. This wasn't just a record of duties performed, it was a map of resurrection, a testament to a quiet, patient, unwavering faith he hadn't even known was being practiced under his own roof. He walked back into the living area, the notebook clutched in his hand as if it were a holy text. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of what he had just broken. Arthur, the family's longtime butler, a man of 60 with a quiet, almost monastic dignity and eyes that missed nothing, was standing by the bar. He wasn't cleaning or preparing anything. He was simply standing there, a silent sentinel, as if waiting. Arthur had been with the Vance family for 30 years. He had served Julian's formidable father, had seen Julian grow from a stiff, awkward boy into a ruthless businessman, had held Caroline's coat on her wedding day. He was less an employee and more a permanent silent witness to the entire Vance family history, its triumphs and its shames. "The boy is finally quiet, sir," Arthur said, his voice perfectly neutral, betraying nothing, yet his very stillness was a form of profound judgment. "She worked with him every single night," the butler continued, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the glittering city lights. He did not wait for Julian to prompt him. "She said his muscles needed to remember how to hold joy. She used to be a pediatric nurse, you know." before she had to leave the profession to care for her ailing brother. Each word was a small, sharp stone, methodically dismantling the crumbling edifice of Julian's righteous anger. He had never asked about her background. The agency file had been a blur of text he'd scanned in 30 seconds while closing a deal. He saw her name, Maya Williams, and noted her race with the detached systemic bias he wasn't even aware he possessed. She was the night nurse. Temporary. A functional object in the sprawling, broken apparatus of his new life. She told me his body remembered the trauma of the accident in every cell, Arthur added, his voice dropping slightly, becoming almost confidential. But she believed his heart could be taught to remember the love that came before it. Julian's throat constricted, the feeling of suffocation returning. His anger, so hot and certain just hours ago, had cooled into a sickening, icy dread. He thought of her face in the nursery, the quiet dignity in her eyes as he'd spat those venomous, unforgivable words at her. "You are not his mother." He had intended it to be the ultimate wound, a final brutal assertion of his own pain's supremacy. And it was. But he realized now, with a clarity that was itself a form of agony, that the wound was his own. He was the absent one, the one who had retreated into the cold, sterile fortress of his work, leaving his son to navigate the aftershocks of a world-shattering tragedy, with a revolving door of well-paid, emotionally distant strangers. Maya hadn't been a stranger. She had been the one who stayed, the one who saw, the one who believed in the possibility of joy after the apocalypse. He walked back to the nursery, the notebook feeling as heavy as a tombstone in his hand. He looked at the last entry again, at the single, hopeful, heartbreaking word she had written at the bottom of the page. Almost. Shame, hot and absolute, burned in his chest. He had walked in on a miracle in progress and had not just failed to recognize it. He had actively, brutally, and perhaps irrevocably destroyed it. Leo's profound regression was swift and terrifyingly absolute. The following morning, he woke not with the low-grade fever of a simple illness, but with the chilling, silent fever of a spirit in retreat. He was no longer just crying. He was hermetically sealed in a bubble of trauma, unresponsive and unreachable. He refused the bottle, pushing it away with a weak but determined hand, his lips pressed into a thin white line. When Julian, his heart aching with a desperate, clumsy tenderness, tried to hold him, Leo flinched away as if from a hot flame, his small body going rigid with a fear that was primal and deeply ingrained. His gaze, once bright and curious, was now dull and fixed on the nursery doorway. A constant, silent, heartbreaking vigil. And then he began to make the sign. He would point a trembling, accusatory finger toward the door and make a small, grasping motion with his hand, a gesture that was both a question and a desperate, soul-deep plea. It was a sign she must have taught him, another secret, intimate language shared between them in the quiet, sacred hours of the night, a language Julian did not understand and now felt he had no right to learn. The pediatrician, Dr. Albright, a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with eyes that seemed to see straight through Julian's polished facade, arrived just before noon. She took one look at Leo, her professional composure tightening into a deep, concerned frown. Her examination was quick, her findings delivered with the blunt force of a diagnosis that was also a clear and damning indictment. "This isn't a medical issue, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp and unforgiving as she packed her medical bag with efficient snaps and clicks. "This is a profound emotional regression. It's trauma, and it's acute. Whatever psychological stability this child had managed to painstakingly build has been completely and utterly shattered. He's retreating into himself as a defense mechanism, and if we don't intervene effectively, this could cause permanent developmental damage. She looked at Julian over the rim of her glasses, her gaze holding him accountable. The previous nurse, the one the agency informed me you dismissed yesterday, I reviewed her detailed notes this morning. They indicated significant, almost miraculous progress with his motor and verbal skills. What, precisely, happened here? Julian, the titan of industry, the man whose confident pronouncements moved global markets and graced the covers of financial magazines, could not form the words. He couldn't bring himself to confess the simple, ugly, unforgivable truth. I walked in on my son's first steps since my wife's death and punished the woman who made them possible. He just shook his head, the lie he was about to tell feeling like sandpaper in his throat. It was a misunderstanding. Dr. Albright's expression morphed into a mask of pure clinical disdain. Well, I suggest you understand this, Mr. Vance. Your son is in an extremely fragile and precarious state. He requires absolute consistency and, more than anything else in the world, a primary attachment figure he trusts implicitly. And right now, that person is very clearly not you. Her words were a clinical vivisection of his failure as a father, each one methodically cutting away another layer of his pride and self-delusion. After she left, the penthouse was suffocating in its silence. The quiet, a mocking echo of the life and hope that had briefly filled it. Julian stood alone in the center of the vast living room, the doctor's brutal assessment ringing in his ears. He had to fix this. Not with money, not with a new team of world-renowned specialists flown in from Switzerland, but with the one currency he had so arrogantly and foolishly discarded: humility. He found the agency's number in his contacts and dialed, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. The administrator on the other end, a woman with a cool, professional voice, was polite but firm, citing a litany of privacy policies and employee protection clauses. But the voice Julian used was not the one of command and power he typically employed. It was the raw, frayed voice of a desperate, broken father. "I need to find Maya Williams," he said, his own voice tight with a shame that was almost choking him. "Please, I have made a terrible, terrible mistake." It took another 10 minutes of what amounted to pleading, but they finally relented. They gave him an address. The address was for a walk-up in a part of the city his car's sophisticated navigation system barely recognized as habitable. He drove himself, the sleek, silent black lines of the Bentley, a stark, alien presence on the narrow gray street, lined with aging brick buildings, their fire escapes tracing rusty patterns against the sky. He found her apartment on the third floor of a building where the hallway smelled of old paint, damp plaster, and the faint, lingering aroma of fried onions. He stood outside her door for a full minute, his heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. 100 different speeches rehearsed and discarded a dozen times in his mind. He finally knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hall. When she opened the door, her eyes widened for a split second in pure, unadulterated surprise, then quickly settled into a careful, guarded neutrality that was more impenetrable than any wall. She was dressed in simple jeans and a faded university t-shirt, her hair loose and curling softly around her shoulders. Behind her, he could see neatly stacked and labeled cardboard boxes. She was packing. She was leaving. "Mr. Vance?" "Maya," he began, the name feeling foreign and rough in his mouth. I came to apologize." She didn't speak, didn't invite him in. She just waited, her arms crossed in a subtle, protective barrier that spoke volumes. What I said, how I acted. There is no excuse for it. None, he said, the words coming out in a rush. I was wrong. He took a ragged breath, the simple act of exhaling feeling like a monumental effort. I saw a moment that I believed was mine to witness, and I was blinded by my own selfish, possessive grief. I didn't see what you were doing. I didn't see you. A flicker of emotion, perhaps pain, perhaps surprise, passed over her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came, her mask of composure firmly back in place. Leo is not doing well, he said, his voice finally breaking, the confession costing him more than any failed business deal ever had. He's retreated. He won't let me near him. He needs you. He needs his father, she corrected, her voice soft, but not without a sharp, clean edge of truth. He has a father who doesn't know how to reach him, Julian admitted, the raw truth of it stripping away the last, tattered vestiges of his pride. Please, come back. I'm not asking you to be his nurse. I'm asking you to be his developmental specialist. You will have full, unmitigated authority. You can hire your own team if you think it's necessary. You'll have an unlimited research budget. Whatever you need. Just name your price. Faces. Maya finally looked up, her gaze searching his, looking past the expensive suit and the desperate, extravagant offer. She was looking for the truth behind the words, for the crack in the armor, for the genuine heart of his regret. It's not about a title or a salary, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice impossibly calm and steady. If I come back, it is only for him, and it will be on my terms. He nodded immediately, desperately, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. Anything. One condition, she said, her voice gaining a new, unshakable firmness that he had never heard before. You have to be there, in the room, for at least one full session, every single day. No phones, no emails, no excuses. You don't get to outsource his healing anymore, Julian. You have to be part of it. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, the ambient sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a passing train, filtering up from the street below. Julian held her gaze, and for the first time since Caroline's death, he felt a flicker of something other than the crushing, monolithic weight of loss. It was a terrifying, fragile, and utterly unfamiliar hope. I will, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. I'll be there. Lena's return to the penthouse was not a quiet, deferential re-entry. It was a fundamental recalibration of the entire household's ecosystem. She arrived the next morning, not with a small, worn duffel bag, but with two large, heavy cases filled with therapeutic equipment. Sensory mats, weighted blankets, specialized blocks, and speech development tools. She walked in not with a housekeeper's deference or a nurse's quiet compliance, but with the unshakable authority of a specialist taking command of a critical, time-sensitive situation. Her first meeting was not with Julian, but with Arthur, the butler, in the cavernous, gleaming expanse of the kitchen. She laid out her terms, her voice calm and clear, but with an underlying steel that left no room for negotiation. Leo's daily schedule, which had been a loose, grief-stricken approximation of normalcy, would now be paramount. It would be rigorously structured around intensive 90-minute blocks of therapeutic play in the morning, sensory integration exercises after his nap, and consistent, gentle exposure to new stimuli, starting with the very textures and sounds of the penthouse from which he had been isolated for over a year. The oppressive silence that had become the home's default state was to be replaced, she declared, with the soft, ambient strains of classical music. She specified Mozart and Bach, explaining to a slightly bemused Arthur, in a tone that brooked no argument, that their mathematical precision and complex harmonies helped regulate a child's nervous system and promote crucial neural development. Arthur, who had witnessed the boy's heartbreaking decline firsthand, received these directives not with resentment, but with a subtle, deeply approving nod. He had seen the state of the child. He recognized a lifeline when he saw one. The first session with Julian was a masterclass in excruciating awkwardness. He arrived in the nursery at precisely 9:30 a.m., dressed in his usual bespoke suit of charcoal gray, looking as out of place as an orchid in a desert. He sat stiffly on the edge of the plush, cream-colored carpet. A man accustomed to commanding boardrooms from a leather throne, now perched uncomfortably on the floor of his son's room. He watched, silent and tense, as Lena guided Leo through a series of simple, passive stretching exercises, her focus entirely on the child. His motor planning and proprioception were severely delayed by the prolonged emotional trauma and subsequent regression, she explained, her tone clinical but not cold. Her hands moved with an expert's confidence, gently manipulating Leo's small limbs. We have to rebuild the neural pathways from the ground up. Before he can even think about walking, he needs to feel safe and connected to his own body again. Julian just nodded, his hands clasped so tightly between his knees that his knuckles were white. A titan of industry reduced to a silent, uncertain, and utterly useless observer. He watched the way she moved, her touch firm but infinitely gentle, her voice a constant soothing murmur that seemed to weave a protective, invisible barrier around the boy. He saw the way Leo's tense little body, which had been as rigid as a board in his own arms, would slowly, almost imperceptibly, relax and yield to her touch. For the first 2 days, that was the full extent of his mandated involvement, watching from the periphery, a ghost at the edge of his own son's healing. He felt a profound sense of uselessness, a feeling so foreign and unwelcome it was almost physically painful. The breakthrough, if one could call something so small and fragile a breakthrough, came on the 3rd day. The air in the nursery was thick with the scent of rain from a passing afternoon shower. Lena was using a set of large, brightly colored wooden blocks, encouraging Leo to stack them. The boy was hesitant, his fine motor skills shaky and uncoordinated. After a moment of intense, trembling effort, he managed to place one square blue block on top of a larger red one, only to have it immediately topple to the floor. A sharp, frustrated cry escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unfiltered rage, and with a surprisingly strong sweep of his small arm, he sent the remaining blocks scattering across the carpet. Julian flinched, an instinctive wave of paternal frustration rising in him. The impulse to correct, to reprimand, to say, "Don't do that, Leo," was immediate and overwhelming. It was the voice of his own father, a man who valued order above all else. But before he could speak, before he could inflict his own inherited anxieties on his grieving son, Lena held up a single, calming hand. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak a word to Leo. She simply began to gather the scattered blocks herself, humming a soft, aimless melody, a tune that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. She started rebuilding the tower, her movements slow, deliberate, and utterly non-judgmental. After a moment of watching her, his cries subsiding into quiet, hiccuping breaths, Leo crawled over. He didn't try to stack a block. He just picked up a single red one and nudged it toward her with his hand. Lena's lips curved into a small, private smile. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered, her voice a balm. "That's a good, strong one for the bottom." Julian watched, holding his breath, a complex, painful knot of grief, frustration, and inadequacy loosening in his chest. He was witnessing a language beyond words, a conversation built on a foundation of patience and radical acceptance. He was learning. Weeks turned into a month, the days marked by the slow, steady rhythm of this fragile, sacred routine. Julian began to anticipate the daily sessions, not with dread, but with a quiet, intense curiosity. He found himself rearranging global conference calls and pushing back deadlines to ensure he was there, on the floor, at 9 a.m. sharp. He learned the names of Leo's favorite stuffed animals, a one-eyed, threadbare bear named Barnaby, and a floppy-eared velvet dog named Patches, both of which had been Caroline's. He learned the specific Bach cello suite that Lena hummed that calmed Leo the fastest after a moment of frustration, and even downloaded it to his own phone, listening to it in the silent car rides home from the office. One rainy afternoon, Lena had 2 low, padded parallel bars installed in the nursery, a piece of equipment she'd ordered herself. She was helping Leo stand between them, his small hands gripping the bars, his legs trembling but holding. He wobbled, his balance suddenly failing. Julian, who was sitting nearby reading a financial report, looked up just in time to see him start to fall. Without a single conscious thought, he dropped the report and lunged forward, his hand shooting out to steady Leo's back at the exact same instant as Lena's. Their hands brushed, his large, calloused from years of gripping golf clubs and shaking hands on multi-million-dollar deals. Hers smaller, softer, but with a surprising, sinewy strength. It was a small, fleeting touch, but the jolt of it, the shared, instinctive parental act of protection, was electric. A current of warmth, of an unspoken, profound connection, lingered in the air between them long after they both pulled their hands away, as if burned. Lena felt a hot flush creep up her neck, and she immediately, professionally, turned her attention back to Leo, her voice a little breathless. "Good save, Leo. You're getting so strong." Julian cleared his throat and stepped back, the intensity of the moment broken, but not forgotten. He looked at their 2 hands, then back at his son, who was now standing, safely supported between them. They were no longer just an employer and his specialist, locked in a contractual arrangement. They were 2 people, tethered by love and loss to the same small, fragile center of gravity. A boy who was finally, painstakingly, learning to stand on his own 2 feet. The tentative, fragile peace that had settled over the penthouse, an ecosystem of therapy sessions, shared glances, and quiet, incremental progress, was shattered by the unexpected, unannounced arrival of Eleanor Vance. She did not call ahead. She did not wait to be announced by Arthur. Julian's mother-in-law swept into the lobby of the building like a winter storm front, dressed in an impeccably tailored Chanel suit of pale gray that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Her silver hair was coiled in a perfect, formidable chignon, and her eyes, the same piercing, intelligent blue as her late daughter's, were as sharp and cold as the diamonds glittering at her ears and throat. Eleanor Vance was a woman who did not ask for permission. She simply took possession of any room she entered, and the penthouse, the home of her only grandson, was, in her mind, fundamentally her territory. She found them in the nursery, mid-session. It was a scene of quiet, focused, domestic industry. Julian, his suit jacket discarded and sleeves rolled to his elbows, was on the floor, helping Leo fit large, chunky pieces into a wooden puzzle of farm animals. Lena knelt beside them, coaching the boy softly, her finger gently guiding his small hand toward the correct shape. Eleanor stopped dead in the doorway, her manicured hand flying to her throat in a gesture of pure, theatrical horror. Her gaze swept over the scene, her expression a mask of undisguised revulsion. The carefully maintained facade of high society composure cracked, revealing the raw, possessive grief that churned beneath. "Julian, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice dripping with an icy disdain that made the warm, sunlit nursery air feel suddenly frigid. Her eyes flickered to Lena, appraising and dismissing her in a single brutal glance, as one might an intrusive, poorly chosen piece of furniture that had inexplicably appeared in a priceless showroom. "Grandma," Leo chirped, the name still a novelty on his tongue, his small face lighting up with the innocent, uncomplicated delight of a child seeing a familiar face. Eleanor's severe expression softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at her grandson, a flicker of genuine, fierce love in her cold eyes. But the warmth vanished the instant her gaze returned to Lena, her expression hardening once more into a mask of contempt. "I was under the impression," she said, her words aimed squarely at Julian like poisoned darts, "that you had hired a qualified team of professionals, psychologists, physical therapists, to oversee Leo's care." Her tone made it unequivocally clear that the woman on the floor with her grandson was not included in that esteemed category. "This is Lena Williams, Mother Vance," Julian said, rising slowly to his feet, his own posture stiffening in response to her attack. "She is Leo's developmental specialist." Eleanor arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, the gesture a masterclass in condescension. "Specialist? The placement agency I contacted for a reference informed me you had hired a temporary night nurse, a colored girl." The archaic, dismissive term hung in the air, ugly and sharp and dissonant in the cheerful nursery. Julian's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing rhythmically in his cheek. "Her qualifications are impeccable. Her results are undeniable. And her race is entirely irrelevant." "Is it?" Eleanor countered, stepping fully into the room, her presence, her expensive perfume, her aura of monolithic self-assurance dominating the space. "I find it highly irregular that this woman has been given such an intimate and influential role in my grandson's life. A boy in his delicate condition, Julian, needs stability. He needs familiarity. He needs family." The implication was a stiletto, sharp, thin, and aimed directly at Lena's heart. Lena was not family. She was an outsider, an interloper, a temporary fixture who had overstepped her bounds. Lena, who had remained silent and still throughout this exchange, her hand resting protectively on Leo's small back, now straightened her spine. She did not rise to her feet. That would be a concession of her place on the floor with Leo, a retreat from her rightful position beside him. She simply looked up, her gaze direct and unclouded by fear. "With all due respect, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice quiet, but imbued with an unshakable firmness that seemed to surprise even Julian. "Leo's condition has improved so dramatically precisely because he has had stability. I have been with him every day, for every small struggle and every tiny victory. That is the very definition of familiarity." "And you believe that gives you some sort of claim on him?" Eleanor scoffed, her lip curling in a faint, ugly sneer. "I believe it gives me a deep and accurate understanding of what this child needs," Lena replied, her voice remaining level, her gaze unflinching. "And right now, he needs patience and trust. He does not need a disruption caused by prejudice and a misplaced sense of ownership." A tense, profound silence ensued, the air in the room crackling with the electricity of unspoken histories and raw, colliding griefs. Julian, caught between the formidable iron will of his late wife's mother and his new, fragile but fiercely protective trust in Lena, finally found his voice. And the man who spoke was not the hesitant, grieving father of weeks past, but the decisive leader he was in the boardroom. "Eleanor," he said, his tone quiet, but leaving no room for negotiation or appeal. "Lena has my full and complete confidence. She stays." Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits of cold, blue fury. "Then you leave me no choice," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I will not stand by and watch my daughter's son be raised by an unqualified, opportunistic stranger. I am speaking to my lawyers this afternoon. I will file for temporary guardianship, citing an unsafe and unstable home environment. We will see what a family court judge has to say about this arrangement." With that final, devastating pronouncement, she turned on her heel and swept out of the room, leaving a vortex of chilling silence in her wake. The threat hung in the air, heavy and real and immediate. Julian ran a hand through his hair, his face pale and drawn. "She's not bluffing," he said quietly, his voice hollow with the certainty of the coming storm. "She will do it." Lena looked down at Leo, who, sensing the seismic shift in the room's emotional landscape, had crawled fully into her lap, his small face buried in the soft fabric of her shirt, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist. The world had just shrunk again, the protective walls of the penthouse closing in. The fight for Leo's future wasn't just about healing his past anymore. It was about to become a war for his present, and Lena knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that she was standing at the very center of the battlefield. Eleanor Vance's threat of a protracted, ugly custody battle threw Julian and Lena into a forced, intense, and profoundly intimate alliance. The penthouse, which had just begun to feel like a space of quiet, therapeutic healing, transformed overnight into a strategic command center for a war they hadn't chosen but were now compelled to fight. Lawyers, their faces grim and their voices a low, constant murmur of legal precedents and strategic options, came and went. The grand, echoing dining room table, once reserved for silent, solitary meals, was now permanently littered with stacks of legal documents, depositions from former staff, and child psychology textbooks that were underlined and flagged with dozens of colored sticky notes. In this new, high-stakes arena, Julian was a different man. The cold, decisive CEO, the one who had been softened and humbled in the quiet of the nursery, re-emerged. But his focus this time was not on profit margins or market share. It was on the singular, ruthless, and all-consuming goal of protecting his son from being torn apart. He and Lena worked late into the night, every night, a strange, sleep-deprived team fueled by endless pots of black coffee and a shared, desperate purpose. He handled the intricate legal strategy, his mind sharp and analytical as he dissected precedents from similar cases and drafted blistering affidavits. She, in turn, became the chief architect of their defense's core argument, meticulously compiling the overwhelming evidence of Leo's progress. She organized her daily logs into a comprehensive timeline, edited hours of video clips that showed his staggering improvement in motor skills, and created detailed charts that tracked his vocabulary expansion from single, hesitant words to simple, joyful, two-word phrases. It was in one of these late-night sessions, surrounded by the ghosts of his wife's law books in the vast, silent library, that Julian's carefully constructed armor of professional detachment finally, completely, cracked. He was staring into an untouched glass of amber whiskey, the crystal catching the low, warm light of the desk lamp when he spoke, his voice so low that Lena had to lean in to hear him over the soft rustle of her papers. "Eleanor blames me for what happened to Caroline," he said, the words heavy, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, dark well. "She's convinced I worked her to death." Lena looked up from the journal she was annotating, her pen pausing mid-sentence. The air in the room grew still. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. Caroline was a partner at her law firm before she was 30. She was brilliant, driven, relentless, he said, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh catching in his throat. She was a force of nature. When she got pregnant with Leo, she refused to slow down. I encouraged it. I was proud of her. We were a power couple, the kind you read about in magazines, the ones who have it all. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the ice clinking softly. Then the complications started. Pre-eclampsia. The doctors ordered mandatory bed rest. She hated it. She said it felt like a cage, like she was being erased. The accident. She was driving back from a client meeting she insisted she had to take. A meeting I didn't stop her from going to. His voice finally broke, a raw, ragged sound of a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Eleanor thinks that if I had been a different kind of husband, a better man, if I had forced her to stop, to rest, she'd still be here. He finally looked at Lena, his eyes stripped bare, raw with a grief he had never allowed anyone to witness before. And the hell of it is, maybe she's right. A long, profound silence filled the room, broken only by the soft, distant hum of the city that never slept, far below them. Lena chose her words with the care and precision of a surgeon tending to a vital artery. "You can't carry the weight of her choices, Julian. They were hers. She was a brilliant, powerful woman. You couldn't have forced her to do anything she didn't want to do. That weight is not yours to carry." She watched him, saw the flicker of protest, of ingrained guilt in his eyes, and she made a decision. It was time to build a different, more profound kind of bridge between them, one built not on a shared purpose, but on shared pain. "I lost someone too," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, confidential whisper. "My younger brother, Germain. He had a rare neurological disorder. I was in my final year of nursing school, top of my class. I was arrogant." She took a shaky breath. "I thought I knew better than his doctors. I thought I could manage his care myself. I was the expert." Tears she hadn't shed in years. Tears she had locked away behind a wall of professional competence, burned hot behind her eyes. I ignored the signs that he was getting worse. I told myself it was just a temporary setback. I was so focused on my own ability to fix him that I didn't see that he was slipping away. Until it was too late. She looked down at her hands, which were clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails dug into her palms. "I left nursing school a week after his funeral. I left because I couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for another life. I felt like a fraud. For a very long time, I believed his death was my fault, my punishment for my pride." Julian stared at her, the vast, unbridgeable gulf between them, of wealth, of race, of life experience, suddenly, completely vanishing. It was replaced by the universal, desolate, and achingly familiar landscape of grief and guilt. In that moment, they were not a billionaire and his son's specialist. They were just two people, haunted by the relentless, whispering ghosts of what-ifs. It was in that moment of shared, devastating vulnerability that their alliance was truly and irrevocably forged. It was no longer a professional arrangement of convenience or necessity. It was a bond, deep and resonant, sealed in the quiet, sacred understanding of shared, unbearable loss. The next morning, driven by this new, unspoken intimacy and a desperate search for anything that might help their case, Lena was looking for a specific file on Leo's early diagnoses in Caroline's old office, a sun-drenched room filled with books and art that Julian had kept locked, a perfect, untouched shrine until now. It was on a high, dusty shelf, tucked away behind a row of dry corporate tax records, that she found them. A set of 5 matching leather-bound journals. They weren't legal pads filled with case notes. They were personal diaries. Her heart pounded a nervous rhythm against her ribs as she carefully took one down and opened it. Caroline's elegant, confident script filled the pages. She wrote of her fierce, all-consuming love for Julian, her deep and boundless excitement for Leo's arrival, but also, threaded through the hopeful, joyful entries, was a subtle, persistent current of deep-seated fear. A fear of losing her own hard-won identity to the all-consuming role of motherhood. A fear her own mother, Eleanor, had relentlessly and subtly instilled in her for years. Mother insists a Vance woman's legacy is her children, not her career. One entry from early in her pregnancy read, "She sees my ambition as a betrayal of my nature, a flaw to be corrected. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I almost believe her." But it was the last journal, the one from the final harrowing weeks before her death, that held the key. Lena's hands trembled as she found the entry, dated just 2 days before the accident. Her breath caught in her throat. Dr. Albright recommended a new form of intensive motor therapy for Leo's developmental delays. She is concerned about his muscle tone. She had a young nurse at the pediatric clinic, a woman named Lena Williams, demonstrate the techniques. She has a gift, a quiet, powerful strength. I see the way she connects with the children nobody else can seem to reach. There is a light in her. If anything ever happens to me, Julian must find her. He won't understand at first. He will fight it, but she will know what to do with our boy. Lena sank into the soft leather of Caroline's desk chair, the journal clutched tightly in her hands, hot tears blurring the elegant, looping ink on the page. Caroline had known. She had seen her. She had chosen her. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a legacy, an inheritance of trust, passed from one mother to another across the veil of death itself. The mediation was held in a sterile, soulless conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown law office, a place of polished mahogany and hushed, expensive silence designed to bleach all emotion from human conflict. Eleanor Vance sat on one side of the vast table, flanked by 2 sharp-suited lawyers who radiated an aura of predatory competence. She was the very picture of bereaved, righteous indignation. On the other side sat Julian, with Lena directly beside him. Her presence was not a provocation. It was a silent, powerful declaration of their united, unshakable front. Eleanor's lead lawyer, a man with silver hair and a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, began. He painted a masterful, condescending picture of a grieving, overwhelmed single father, a man so consumed by his work that he had recklessly outsourced his most sacred parental duties to an unlicensed, unvetted, and dangerously opportunistic caregiver. He presented glossy, artfully framed photographs of Lena's modest apartment building, highlighted her failure to complete nursing school, and systematically questioned her qualifications with surgical precision. "This woman, Your Honor," he concluded, his voice resonating with a dramatic, practiced gravitas, "is a risk, a dangerous, unknown variable that my client, in her profound love for her only grandson, is simply not willing to accept." When it was their turn, Julian spoke first, but his strategy was a shocking, brilliant departure from the aggressive defense his own lawyers had meticulously prepared. He didn't defend himself, he confessed. "For the first year after my wife's death, I was not the father my son, Leo, deserved," he said, his voice clear and steady, resonating with the quiet, irrefutable power of unvarnished truth. "I was lost in my own grief. I was absent, and in many ways, I failed him. He turned his gaze directly to Eleanor, not with anger, but with a look of profound, sorrowful acknowledgement. You were right to be concerned. I was concerned. He paused, allowing the weight of his admission to settle in the silent room, then turned his body slightly, a subtle but significant gesture of inclusion and partnership toward Lena. But then, I did the one thing my late wife, Caroline, asked of me. I found the person she instructed me to find. With a calm, deliberate movement, he slid a document across the polished surface of the table. It was a notarized, certified copy of Caroline's final damning journal entry. Eleanor's lawyer picked it up, his confident, predatory smirk faltering as he read the words. Eleanor leaned over, her own eyes scanning the familiar, elegant handwriting of her daughter. A small, sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, a tiny, heartbreaking sound of shock and utter disbelief in the quiet room. Caroline chose Lena, Julian said softly. She knew Leo would need someone with a specific gift, a specific kind of strength. And, as always, she was right. Then, it was Lena's turn to speak. She didn't rise. She remained seated, her posture radiating a calm, centered strength that seemed to quiet the very air in the room. She didn't speak of her qualifications or her therapeutic methods. She spoke of Leo. She described the little boy she had first met. A child encased in a fortress of silence, withdrawn and profoundly afraid of a world that had taken everything from him. And then, her voice softening, she described the boy he was becoming. Curious, brave, a child who was starting to laugh again, a child who was learning to trust that the world would not always break beneath his feet. She had brought Caroline's other journals with her. She opened one, its leather cover worn and soft. Caroline didn't fear motherhood, Lena said, her voice gentle but firm as she looked directly at Eleanor, a look not of accusation, but of shared, tragic understanding. She feared that your expectations of what a mother should be would suffocate her, just as those same fears were beginning to suffocate her son. Leo doesn't need to be protected in a gilded cage, Mrs. Vance. He needs the freedom to stumble, and the profound safety of knowing that someone will always, always be there to help him stand up again. She closed the journal softly. That is what I have given him. It is what his mother wanted for him. And it is what his father is now, every single day, learning with courage and humility to give him, too. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. Eleanor stared at the copied journal entry, then at Lena, then at her son-in-law. The icy armor of her righteousness, so carefully and painfully constructed over 18 months of grief and anger, began to crack. Beneath it was not a monster, but a grieving mother, terrified of losing the last living piece of her daughter. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her eyes. She never told me, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, the sound of a heart shattering in the quiet, sterile room. She never told me she felt that way. The fight was over. Later that evening, after Eleanor had tearfully and formally withdrawn her guardianship petition, Julian found Lena standing on the penthouse balcony. The city lights glittered below them like a vast fallen constellation. Caroline's journals, he said, coming to stand beside her, his voice filled with a quiet, reverent awe. You were her voice today. I just read her words, Lena replied, her gaze fixed on the distant, dark horizon. You gave them life, he insisted. He reached out, his hand gently, tentatively, covering hers where it rested on the cool metal of the railing. She entrusted him to you. And now, I am, too. He pulled a folded legal document from the inner pocket of his jacket. It was an updated page from his last will and testament. He had spent the entire afternoon with his lawyers. He had amended the guardianship clause. It now read, "In the event of my death or incapacitation, full and sole guardianship of my son, Leo Vance, is to be granted to Lena Williams, who has proven herself to be a protector of his well-being and a steward of his mother's most sacred legacy." "Julian, she started, her voice thick with an overwhelming wave of emotion. "This isn't a contract, Lena," he said, his eyes searching hers in the soft, ambient glow of the city. "It's a promise. You are his family. You are our family." She didn't pull her hand away. And in the quiet of the night, high above the sleeping city, two fractured souls and one little boy were no longer just surviving a tragedy. They were beginning, together, to build a home. A new kind of quiet, one that was peaceful, organic, and alive, settled into the Vance penthouse in the weeks following the seismic mediation. It wasn't the sterile, empty silence of profound, unarticulated grief, but the gentle, humming stillness of a life being painstakingly, lovingly rebuilt. The sound of Leo's hesitant, happy chatter, once a shocking rarity, now filled the rooms. He would follow Lena from the nursery to the kitchen, a small, determined shadow, narrating his world in a charming, chaotic patchwork of single words and newly formed two-word phrases. "Lena, up! Leo, block! Daddy, home!" Each utterance was a small, precious miracle, a testament to the deep, foundational healing that was taking root in the home's wounded heart. The victory against Eleanor had not been a triumph of conquest, but a painful, necessary, and ultimately graceful realignment of their shattered family. She had begun visiting twice a week, no longer as a formidable matriarch inspecting her territory, but as a grandmother, tentative, humble, and learning. She would sit on the floor, her impeccably tailored Chanel suit a stark, beautiful contrast to the colorful chaos of Leo's toy blocks, and she would listen, really, truly listen, as Lena guided the boy through his exercises. One afternoon, as Leo successfully stacked a teetering tower of 5 blocks for the very first time, Eleanor turned to Lena, her eyes holding a sad, clear, and profound wisdom. "I spent so many years telling Caroline what a mother should be," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, aching regret. "I never stopped to ask her what kind of mother she wanted to be. Thank you for showing me the difference." The words were a quiet peace treaty, an acceptance not just of Lena's role, but of her own daughter's long-silenced truth. Lena's role in the house had solidified, transforming from specialist to the undeniable emotional architect of their new life. Julian, forever changed by the confrontation with his own grief and his wife's hidden truths, was more present than he had been in his son's entire life. He rescheduled international meetings, left the office at a reasonable hour, and made their evening therapy sessions a non-negotiable, sacred part of his day. One evening, as they sat together on the living room carpet, a comfortable silence between them, watching Leo finally take 3 wobbly, independent steps from the sofa to the ottoman, Julian reached for Lena's hand without a word. It was a simple, spontaneous gesture, filled with a universe of unspoken gratitude and a burgeoning, tender affection that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was looking at her not as an employee, not as a savior, but as a partner, an equal. It was in this atmosphere of fragile, growing, and deeply cherished peace that the final storm broke, arriving not with the bang of a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, devastating slit of a white, official-looking envelope delivered by a stone-faced courier. It was from the State Nursing Board. Julian was there when she opened it. He saw the color drain from her face, saw her hand tremble as she read the single, devastating sheet of paper. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with immediate protective concern. "It's a formal notice," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the paper shaking in her grasp as if it were alive. "My nursing license. It's under review for immediate suspension." Julian took the paper from her, his own eyes scanning the dense, weaponized legalese. The complaint was anonymous, but the allegations were vicious and surgically precise. It accused her of practicing medicine without a license by designing and administering unapproved therapies to a minor child. It cited unethical emotional transference leading to parental alienation. And, most cruelly, it referenced her history of professional negligence resulting in emotional distress for abruptly leaving her previous post after the death of a patient, her brother, Jermaine. "This is Eleanor," Julian said instantly, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She lost in court. So now she's trying to come at you from another, dirtier angle." But Lena slowly shook her head, a sickening, cold certainty dawning in her eyes, a truth she could feel in her bones. "No, this isn't her. The details about my brother, the official diagnosis, the date he died. The records from that hospital are sealed juvenile files. No one knows those details. No one in the world except—" She trailed off, her mind racing back to the very beginning, to the faceless bureaucracy of the placement agency, to the exhaustive, invasive background checks, the confidential files she had been required to submit. Someone had dug into the deepest, most protected, most painful corner of her past, and had weaponized her most profound wound against her. The fight wasn't over. It had just found a new, more cruel and personal battlefield. They weren't just trying to take Leo away from her anymore. They were trying to take away the very core of who she was, the healer, the caregiver. They were trying to tell the world that her gift was, in fact, a crime, and that her love was a form of negligence. The final scene unfolded not in a sterile courtroom or a high-stakes boardroom, but in the quiet, sunlit living room of the penthouse, a space that had transformed over the last few months from a gallery of grief into a sanctuary of hard-won healing. It had been 3 long, agonizing days since the notice from the nursing board had arrived. 3 days of frantic late-night calls to lawyers, of strategic consultations, and of a gnawing dread that had settled deep in Lena's bones. Julian had mobilized his entire legal team, a veritable army of the city's best and brightest. But the anonymous complaint was insidious, a venomous ghost they couldn't seem to fight in the open. This morning, he had called an emergency meeting. Not with his lawyers, but with the only people who mattered. Lena sat on the plush sofa, a mug of untouched chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. Julian paced before the fireplace, his movements tight with a restrained, simmering fury. And on the armchair opposite Lena, looking smaller and more fragile than ever, but with a new, clear light in her eyes, sat Eleanor Vance. "I did not file that complaint," Eleanor said, as soon as she arrived, her voice clear and devoid of any artifice, her gaze directed squarely and respectfully at Lena. "I know what you must think of me, but my war with you is over. I would never, ever use your family's past against you. That is a line I would not cross." Lena looked at her, and, to her own surprise, she believed her completely. The calculated cruelty of the attack didn't have Eleanor's polished, legalistic signature. This was something else. This was gutter fighting. It was then that Arthur, the butler, his face a mask of grave concern, entered the room, his usual impeccable composure slightly frayed. "Sir," he said, his voice low and steady, "there is someone here to see you. He says it's a matter of extreme urgency regarding the nursing complaint." A man stepped into the room behind Arthur. He was of average height, dressed in a nondescript suit that looked a size too big for his frame, his face a mask of nervous, profuse sweat. It was Mr. Henderson, the perpetually anxious regional manager from the nursing placement agency. "I had to come," Henderson stammered, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding everyone's gaze. I made a call I shouldn't have. There was pressure." "Pressure from whom?" Julian demanded, stepping forward, his voice a low growl that made Henderson flinch. Henderson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "A board member at my agency. He's also on the board of a major corporate rival of yours, Mr. Vance, a man named Peterson. He heard about Miss Williams, about her success with your son. He saw an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Lena asked, her own voice dangerously quiet, cutting through Henderson's nervous rambling. "To create a scandal," Henderson admitted, the words spilling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. "To paint you as unstable, your hiring practices as reckless and unorthodox. Peterson wanted to trigger a stock drop, to create an opening for a hostile takeover of your Asian division. He paid me handsomely to dig up your entire confidential file, to find anything that could be twisted. He's the one who filed the anonymous complaint with the board." The ugly, simple, devastating truth landed in the room with a thud. This was never about Leo's welfare. It was never even about Lena. It was about money. It was about a ruthless corporate predator using a woman's deepest grief and a child's profound vulnerability as collateral damage in a cold, brutal game of power. Lena closed her eyes for a brief moment. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it, the absolute soullessness, was breathtaking. But when she opened them again, there was no fear left. There was only a calm, cold, clarifying fire. "Do you have proof of this?" Lena asked, her voice steady as she looked directly at Henderson. "Does Peterson have any evidence of your conversation?" Henderson nodded miserably, his hand fumbling in his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, sleek audio recorder. "I record all my sensitive calls," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "It's a habit. For protection. It's all on here." Julian took the recorder, his expression hardening into something Lena had never seen before. It was not the face of a grieving father or a humbled CEO. It was the face of a man who was about to burn down an entire empire to protect his own. The rest happened with astonishing, ruthless speed. Julian's lawyers, armed with the undeniable evidence on the recording, filed for an immediate injunction against the nursing board's review and a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against Peterson and his firm. The nursing board, presented with clear, irrefutable evidence of a malicious, fabricated complaint, threw out the case against Lena within hours, issuing a formal apology. By evening, the story had broken across every major financial news network, and Peterson's career, along with his company's stock, was in a spectacular, irreversible freefall. That night, the three of them, Julian, Lena, and Eleanor, sat together in the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm, dancing glow on their faces. Leo was asleep upstairs, safe, his dreams untroubled. "It's over," Julian said, his voice filled with a profound, weary relief. "For now," Lena replied softly, a small, wise smile touching her lips. Eleanor reached across the space between them and placed a delicate, cool hand on Lena's. "You are an extraordinary woman, Lena Williams," she said, her voice filled with a respect that had been hard-won and was now absolute. Caroline saw it from the very beginning. Julian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. "This house," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It was just a structure, a beautiful, empty shell. You filled it. You brought the light back in." He turned to face her, his eyes shining with a love that was raw, real, and undeniable. "I know this isn't how these things are supposed to go. I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I can't imagine this life, my life, Leo's life, without you in it." Lena stood, her heart so full it felt like it might break. She walked toward him, and this time, when he reached for her, she didn't hesitate. He pulled her into an embrace that was not about gratitude or relief, but about a profound, quiet, and deeply earned love. "You didn't just teach him to walk," Julian whispered into her hair. "You taught me how to live again." A year later, on a warm spring afternoon, a small, intimate group gathered in the penthouse's newly renovated rooftop garden. Greenery bloomed everywhere, a vibrant, fragrant testament to life's stubborn, beautiful persistence. Leo, now walking and running with a confident, joyful stride, chased a monarch butterfly across the soft, green grass. Julian, holding a small, open velvet box, knelt before Lena. Eleanor stood by, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her smile genuine and bright. "Lena Williams," Julian said, his voice clear and full of a joy that was once unimaginable. "You came into my life to care for my son. Instead, you saved us both. Will you be my wife? Will you officially be our family?" And Lena, her face wet with happy tears, looked from the man she loved to the little boy who had become her heart, and gave the only answer possible. Yes. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with laughter, and the family, built not on blood, but on the unshakable foundation of courage, trust, and a love that had been tested by fire, was finally, beautifully, and completely whole.